The desert doesn't whisper, it listens. Long stretches of nothing but heat and silence, broken only by the wind dragging memories across the sand. And it was in that silence, just past dusk, that Jonah Briggs saw her, curled near the base of a dead mesquite tree, skin caked in red dirt, blood pooling beneath her like spilled ink on the land. She didn't move. She didn't cry. But when he dismounted and knelt beside her, her cracked lips parted just enough to breathe one word: help. Jonah wasn't a man who ran toward trouble. Life had taught him early that sticking your neck out got it broken. But something in that voice, ragged as it was, hit harder than a bullet. He'd seen pain before. Men shot in card games, women weeping over children taken by fever. But this was different. This was forgotten pain. Pain the world had already stepped over. And Jonah, with his battered boots and bitter past, couldn't walk away this time. She couldn't have been older than 15. Her dress was torn, hands blistered, and a deep gash on her side pulsed with every shallow breath. There was no sign of who she was or where she'd come from. Just her, the blood, and that word hanging in the air like smoke. Help. Jonah lifted her gently, felt the weight of her bones press against his arms like a secret the desert didn't want to tell. He wrapped her in his coat, mounted up, and rode for the nearest ridge before night swallowed them whole. Every hoofbeat echoed louder than the last, as if the land itself knew it was carrying more than just a man and a girl. It was carrying consequence. Jonah had no plan, no supplies, and no reason to believe she'd survive the ride. But he rode anyway, because in that moment, when her eyes found his and refused to close, he saw something he'd long forgotten. That even in a world as cruel as this one, someone still believed in being saved. What happened after that ride wouldn't just change his life. It would shake a town to its core and leave behind a story etched into every gust of desert wind that passed that hollow tree. A story not of heroism or rescue, but of what happens when a man finally listens to something other than his own fear and answers the one word that still matters when everything else is gone: help. The trail back to Hollow Creek was long and unforgiving. 30 miles of cracked earth, dying cacti, and sun-bleached bones. Jonah rode hard, the girl cradled against his chest, every jolt of the horse threatening to tear what little life she had left. Her breath rattled like dry leaves, shallow and uncertain. He kept whispering to her, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was for her. Maybe it was for him. "Stay with me, kid," he said, over and over. "You're not alone now." But the desert didn't care. It only watched. Jonah hadn't been back to Hollow Creek in over 2 years. Last time, he'd left behind a fight, a funeral, and a name he didn't want anymore. Folks there didn't forget easily, and they sure didn't forgive. But none of that mattered now. He wasn't riding for himself. He was riding for a girl he didn't know, whose only sin was surviving something she couldn't outrun. And in a land where justice was often just another word for revenge, that made her dangerous. When he reached the edge of town, just past midnight, the streets were empty. The saloon's windows glowed soft. The church steeple watched like a silent witness. Jonah headed straight for Doc Halbert's place, a shack 2 buildings past the blacksmith, with a lantern always burning low in the front window. He knocked once, then kicked the door in. The old doctor blinked through whiskey and sleep, but when he saw the blood, he sobered fast. "Get her on the table," he barked. The hours that followed were a blur of thread, boiling water, and whispered prayers. Jonah stood back, fists clenched, blood on his coat drying to a dark rust. Doc worked fast. He always had steady hands, even when they shook from age. "She's been cut deep," he muttered. "Too deep for a child." Jonah didn't ask how or why. He just stood there, jaw locked, eyes fixed on her face. Her skin was gray, lips blue, but she was still breathing. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Doc stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "She'll live," he said, voice cracking. But someone did this to her, and they meant for her to die slow. Jonah didn't answer. He just walked out into the rising sun, the dust of his past starting to stir around his boots. He'd come back to Hollow Creek for one reason: to disappear. But now, he had a different reason to stay. And he knew, deep down, that whoever left that girl to die wasn't finished yet. The town woke slow that morning, unaware that something had changed during the night. Children chased roosters through muddy streets, and ranch hands spat dust as they hauled hay. But news travels fast in a place like Hollow Creek, especially when it smells like blood. By mid-morning, whispers spread like wildfire. Jonah Briggs was back, and he brought trouble with him. Some said he found a girl half dead. Others said she was cursed. A few just muttered he should have stayed gone. Jonah stayed by her side in Doc's back room, watching every breath she took like it might be her last. She hadn't woken. Her face was gaunt, stitched along her ribs, her hands still trembling from pain or memory. He couldn't tell which. Doc came in and out, muttering about infection, fever, and time. But Jonah didn't move. He fed her broth with a spoon, held her hand when she stirred in her sleep, and waited. Because he knew something most others had forgotten. Sometimes the only way to keep a soul alive is to stay. By the third day, she opened her eyes. Wide, clear, terrified. She tried to sit up but winced, crying out in a voice barely louder than the wind. Jonah was there, hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he whispered. She blinked at him, confused. Then, with a voice that cracked like dry wood, she asked, "Is he gone?" Jonah's heart turned cold. He didn't ask who he was. He just nodded slowly. "He's not here, but I'll make sure he stays that way." She wouldn't say much at first, but she gave him a name, Lily, in a town she'd fled from, Breakers Hollow, 80 miles west, a place Jonah knew too well. He remembered its sheriff, mean as a whip and twice as cruel. If she'd escaped from there, it wasn't by chance. It was because someone gave her a reason to run, and now that same someone might come looking to finish what they started. Jonah knew the West. He knew its rules, and one of them was simple. What you leave unfinished always comes back for you. So that night, as Lily slept and the fire in the hearth burned low, Jonah sat with a rifle across his knees, his eyes locked on the door. He'd spent most of his life trying not to care, trying to outrun every mess he'd ever been part of. But this time was different, because this time, someone had asked for help, and he had said yes. And now that he had, he knew there was no turning back. Not in the West. Not when blood had already been spilled. By the end of the week, Lily could walk short distances, her small frame swaying like a sapling in a dust storm. She didn't talk much, but she stayed close to Jonah. Too close, he realized, for it to be just fear. It was instinct, the kind born from being hunted. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow was a threat. And Jonah understood that too well. He'd once spent 3 years looking over his shoulder for a man he'd wronged in a poker game gone violent. But what Lily had run from, that was something darker. He tried not to press her for answers, but some stories don't wait to be told. One night, after the fire had gone dim and the wind slipped in through the cracks in the window, she said it. "He were a star," she whispered. Jonah froze. "The sheriff." She nodded, said I was a thief. Took me in, but I never stole nothing. Then he wouldn't let me leave. Her voice trembled, said if I screamed, no one would care. Jonah stared into the fire, fists tight. He believed her, not just because of the words, but because he'd seen that kind of evil before, dressed in law, hiding behind a badge. The next morning, Jonah rode out to the general store. He didn't say much, just bought a second canteen, some new cartridges, and enough supplies for 3 days' travel. The storekeep asked if he was riding out alone. "Not this time," Jonah said, mounting up. Folks watched him leave like they always did, with that mixture of fear and fascination. But no one stopped him. They knew Jonah wasn't the kind of man to ride without a reason. And now, he had the most dangerous reason a man in the West could have, justice that wasn't written in ink. He didn't take Lily with him on that first ride. He rode toward Breakers Hollow alone, not to finish anything, but to see, to measure the shape of the danger. The town hadn't changed much. Same crooked sign, same saloon that smelled of rotgut and regret. He kept his hat low, asked few questions, but what he saw turned his stomach. Posters of Lily nailed to a post. Wanted, runaway, dangerous, with her face sketched like an outlaw, and the signature of Sheriff Dent beneath it in bold black ink. Jonah tore the poster down, crumpled it in his hand, and turned back before the sun dipped too far west. On the ride home, the wind cut colder, as if the land itself disapproved of what men had become. He now understood what Lily was running from, and he knew the truth. She hadn't escaped. Not really. Not until he was dealt with. And for the first time in years, Jonah didn't feel tired. He felt ready, not for revenge, but for something far more dangerous in the Old West, righteousness. When Jonah returned, Lily met him at the edge of town, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, eyes searching his face for something he hadn't said yet. "You went back," she whispered. He nodded. "I saw the poster." She didn't cry. She just looked down and said, "Then he'll come." Jonah placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let him." And in those two words, he gave her something no one else ever had, the right to stop running. They spent the next day preparing, not for war, but for truth. Jonah spoke to the sheriff of Hollow Creek, a decent man with a weak spine. "This girl's staying," Jonah said. "If Dent comes, you stand down, or you stand behind me." The sheriff hesitated, but nodded. The town was changing. They could all feel it. Jonah's presence alone stirred old guilt in men who'd long buried their conscience. And Lily, she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was flesh, blood, and courage in the face of something bigger than fear. Jonah trained her slowly. How to handle a rifle. How to spot movement in brush. How to breathe through the fear and not let it speak for her. Not because he wanted her to fight, but because he wanted her to choose. In the West, every day was a gamble. But when you knew how to protect yourself, even fear had to negotiate. And Lily, with her bruised ribs and healing scars, had begun to change. She stood straighter, spoke louder. The dust no longer clung to her. It obeyed her. That night, as they sat by the fire, Lily said something that stayed with Jonah long after the flames died. "Back there, I thought no one would ever come. I thought the world had agreed to forget me." Jonah looked at her, eyes tired but firm. "The world don't get to decide that. You do." She smiled just barely, but it was real. And for the first time since he found her curled in the dust, Jonah saw not a victim, but the start of a reckoning. And somewhere out there, under the same stars and wind, Sheriff Dent still rode with a badge he didn't deserve. But this time, the road wasn't empty. This time, someone was waiting. And when the West waits, it doesn't wait quietly. It waits with fire, with grit, and with the memory of a girl who said help and meant fight. The warning came at dawn, carried by a rider with dust on his tongue and sweat on his collar. Sheriff Dent was 2 days out, maybe less. He rode with 3 men, quiet ones, not the kind who drank and boasted, but the kind who shot first and disappeared before the echo. When the rider finished his message, Jonah simply nodded. He didn't ask who sent it. He knew how stories traveled in the West, through favors, through guilt, through men who'd seen too much and still remembered what decency used to feel like. Jonah didn't panic. He sharpened his knife, oiled his rifle, and checked the hinges on every door and window in Doc Halberd's back room, where Lily still slept most nights. She knew they were coming. She didn't flinch. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and started helping, nailing planks, tying off ropes, feeding the fire. She no longer carried fear in her hands. She carried readiness. And Jonah, watching her move through that house like she belonged in it, realized that he was no longer protecting her alone. She was standing beside him. The townsfolk began to stir, unsure where they stood. Some remembered what Dent was, a sheriff in badge only, with too many bodies in the dirt behind him. Others feared his return would bring more violence. But the quiet ones, the mothers who had seen girls disappear, the men who remembered their daughters' names before they buried them, those were the ones who came to Jonah without words, leaving things behind. Ammo, salt, bandages. And one of them, the blacksmith's wife, took Lily's hand and simply said, "You don't run this time." Jonah built a barrier just inside the church fence. Not to trap Dent, but to show the town where the line was drawn. He didn't make speeches. He didn't rally crowds. He just stood, and beside him stood Lily, no longer curled in the dust, no longer begging to be heard. She stood tall, with the sun behind her and the wind in her face. The same wind that once carried her cries now carried her presence. And that was louder than any shout. As the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, Jonah lit a lantern and hung it on the old mesquite tree just outside town. The same kind of tree where he first found her, bleeding and silent. But now it wasn't a place of pain. It was a beacon, a signal not just to Dent, but to the land itself. "We remember what you did, and we're not afraid anymore." Dent rode into Hollow Creek with dust on his boots and murder in his eyes. His star still gleamed on his chest, polished to distract from the rot behind it. The three men with him were hardened, eyes narrow, fingers twitching. But the moment they crossed into town, they felt it. Something had shifted. The streets weren't silent with fear. They were waiting. Jonah stood near the well, hat low, rifle slung loose, but ready. And beside him, Lily. Dent dismounted slowly, scanning the faces around him. "You've got something that belongs to me," he said, voice like gravel soaked in oil. Jonah didn't move. "She doesn't belong to anyone." Dent smirked. "That girl is a fugitive, a thief, and you're harboring her." Lily stepped forward then, not behind Jonah, but in front. Her voice, though not loud, was clear. "I'm not the one hiding. You are." There was a pause. Not long, just enough to crack the weight of silence. Then Dent reached for his gun, but Jonah was faster. The shot rang out like thunder trapped in bone. Dent's gun clattered to the ground before he could raise it, a bullet through his hand. He screamed, fell to one knee, and the town didn't move. No one helped him. No one flinched. The three men behind him stood frozen, unsure what to do when fear no longer paved their way. Lily walked toward Dent, slow, sure, until she stood just out of his reach. "You told me no one would care," she said. "You were wrong." Then she turned her back on him, not to insult him, but to prove that he no longer had power. Jonah watched her, pride burning in his chest like wildfire. Not because Dent had fallen, but because Lily had risen. Dent and his men were escorted out of Hollow Creek with their weapons taken and their pride shattered. No rope, no bloodshed, no gallows. Just exile, the kind the West delivers with quiet finality. And, as the dust of their horses faded into the distance, Hollow Creek felt different. Not healed, but awakened. Because in a town where silence had once reigned, one girl's voice had drawn the line. And behind her stood not just one man, but a whole town learning to stand too. The days that followed were quiet, not with fear, but with relief. For the first time in a long while, Hollow Creek breathed without holding its chest. The streets were no longer lined with eyes darting toward shadows. Children played in the alleys again. Doors stayed open past sundown. But most of all, people began to look Lily in the eyes, not as a ghost, not as a problem, but as a person. And for a town as scarred as Hollow Creek, that was something close to a miracle. Lily didn't speak of Den again. She didn't have to. The mark he left had been overwritten, not forgotten, but repurposed. She began helping Doc Halbert more often, cleaning wounds, learning herbs, sitting beside mothers whose sons came home with broken bones or bleeding knuckles. She became a fixture in the town, but not because of what happened, because of who she chose to be afterward. Strong, gentle, unshaken. And Hollow Creek, in its quiet western way, began to reshape around her. Jonah stayed, though no one asked him to. The man who once rode away from everything was now the one folks sought out for advice, for help, even just for company on long, slow walks past the river. He never spoke of why he came back. But those who'd seen the way he looked at Lily when she wasn't watching, how he stood just behind her, always one step to the side, always ready, understood. He hadn't saved her. She had saved him. And that was something the West didn't see often. One night, during a gathering outside the old church, a fire crackled in the center of the circle, and someone asked Lily to speak. At first, she hesitated. Then, standing tall in the glow of the flames, she said only this: "I asked for help. He gave it. You listened. And now, I don't need to run anymore." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent, because in that moment, the town realized they had witnessed not just survival, but a transformation. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the scrub brush and sunburnt sky, other stories continued, some cruel, some kind. But here, in this patch of earth where a bleeding girl once whispered a single word, the story had changed. The dust hadn't won. The silence hadn't swallowed her. And a town that once turned away had chosen to stand still and listen. Months passed, and the rhythm of Hollow Creek settled into something almost unfamiliar: peace. The saloon still echoed with laughter and broken deals. The church still rang its bell every Sunday, and the blacksmith still cursed the heat by mid-morning. But now, beneath it all, was a thread of memory. A lesson branded not on skin, but on conscience, that when you stand beside someone broken and bleeding, You're not just saving them, you're changing yourself. Lily built a small garden behind the doctor's office, planting herbs that could heal wounds deeper than skin. She didn't say much about why she chose each one, but those who received her care noticed something. Her touch was sure, but never forceful. Her silence wasn't distance, it was wisdom. And every time someone sat in her presence, they felt something rare in the West: safety. Jonah repaired the broken fence near the east gate and carved a small figure from cedar, a girl curled in the dust, with a single hand reaching out. He placed it on a post and never spoke about it, but Lily saw it one day and traced her fingers over the grain. No words passed between them. None were needed, because some stories are best left where they began, not buried, but honored. And those strangers still rode through now and then, looking for trouble or tales. They all felt the same thing when they passed the lantern near the mesquite tree. This place was guarded, not by walls or rifles, but by the memory of one girl's courage and one man's choice to stay. And that kind of protection couldn't be bought, threatened, or faked. It had to be earned. And so, the fire continued to burn, not just in the hearth of an old cabin or in the lanterns that lined the street, but in the hearts of the people who chose, when it mattered most, not to turn away. In Hollow Creek, they would tell you, she didn't cry for revenge. She asked for help. And because someone answered, the world bent, just enough, for a new ending. One where dust gave way to roots, and silence gave way to voice. Spring came with slow rains and green shoots bursting through the red soil. The kind of growth you don't notice at first, until one morning you wake up, and everything has changed. That's how Hollow Creek felt now. Different. Not loud, not proud, but steady. The people moved with more purpose. They looked each other in the eye. And when strangers passed through, they didn't just warn them about the trail ahead. They told them about the girl who changed the town by surviving it. Lily started teaching the younger ones, not just letters and numbers, but how to see, how to read tracks in the dirt, how to know when someone's smile hides something sharp. She didn't call it wisdom. She called it paying forward. And the children adored her, not because she told them what to do, but because she listened. And when they asked where she came from, she always answered the same: far enough to know what matters. Jonah, older now in his eyes if not his body, took to patrolling the edges of town, not like a sheriff, but like a promise. He never wore a badge, never asked for thanks, but he was always there, quiet, watching, a rifle across his back, a story behind his silence. People respected him not for the fire in his gun, but for the fire in his heart, the one that refused to go out, even when the wind howled hardest. And sometimes, just before dusk, you could find the two of them sitting beneath the mesquite tree where the old lantern still hung, swinging gently in the breeze. They wouldn't say much, sometimes nothing at all, but if you listened closely, you'd hear the wind say something soft, like gratitude, like memory. Like the land itself hadn't forgotten the moment a man stopped for a girl bleeding in the dust. And everything changed. What started as rescue had become something far deeper: reclamation. Of a name. Of a place. Of a story that could have ended in silence, but didn't. And in the West, where too many stories ended before they began, this one endured, not because of bullets or vengeance, but because a girl spoke one word, and someone chose to answer. Years later, long after the old saloon had been rebuilt and the garden behind Doc Halbert's clinic had grown into a wild tangle of life, a rider arrived in Hollow Creek. Young, lost, and limping. He didn't speak much, and folks could see the weight he carried, even before he removed his hat. Lily found him sitting near the well, blood drying on his sleeve, eyes hollow. She didn't ask what happened. She only offered a drink of water and a seat near the fire. He said one word: quiet, fragile, help. And in that moment, time folded. Jonah, now older and grayer, leaned against the porch post, watching. He saw what Lily did next. Not grand, not loud. She simply nodded, placed a blanket on the boy's shoulders, and sat beside him, just like Jonah had, all those years ago. The fire crackled behind them, same as always. Alive, strong, waiting. And so the story began again. Not the same, but familiar. Because in a place like Hollow Creek, the legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was passed through hands, through kindness, through one voice whispering to another, "You're not alone." And that was the fire that never went out. So when the storms came again, and they always did, the people of Hollow Creek didn't just brace for them. They lit the fire first. In the harsh silence of the West, where mercy is rare and justice often rides too late, the story of Hollow Creek became a living reminder of what can happen when someone chooses to stop, kneel, and listen. Jonah didn't find a hero's path. He found something far harder, the strength to care when it would have been easier to look away. And Lily, broken and barely breathing, didn't just survive, she transformed. Not just herself, but an entire town that once believed silence was safer than standing up. This wasn't a tale of gunfights or glory. It was a story about one word: help, spoken in a whisper that cracked the stillness of a cruel world. And because someone answered, because someone said yes when it mattered most, that word rippled through every heart it touched. From pain came purpose, from fear came voice, and from dust came legacy. One that didn't need statues or songs, only firelight and memory. What Jonah and Lily built was more than shelter. It was proof that when a person chooses courage over comfort, when they refuse to be ruled by fear or regret, they can shape the land around them. Not through force, but through presence, through choice. The kind of choice that doesn't just change lives, it restores them. That's the real lesson of the West. That even in a world so often built on power, it's compassion that outlasts it all. So now the question is yours to carry. When the moment comes, when someone needs you, and all they have left is a whisper, will you hear it? Will you stop? Will you reach for them, even if no one else does? Because maybe the most powerful thing we ever do is answer. Not with speeches, not with strength, but with the quiet, steady courage to stay. If this story moved you, if it sparked something deep in your chest, stay close. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with someone who still believes the world can be changed by kindness. Because here, we honor stories that light the dark, voices that once trembled, and fires that still burn long after the storm has passed.